Right now, I want to talk about George Washington's greatest legacy. If I were to ask you, especially those of you from the United States, what is George Washington's greatest legacy? You may think to yourself, gee, there's so many things, what could it be? Is it the fact that he was the leader of the Revolution? Is it the fact that he recognized that the original government of the United States, the Articles of Confederation, didn't work and needed to be revised? Is it the fact that he called a convention of Philadelphia to do just that, which he presided over, which led to the Constitution of the United States, the one that is still in use today? Is it the fact that he served as the first president under that new Constitution, with all the precedents that that set? Wow, you might think, any one of those things alone is a huge legacy for any one man. Which one of those is his greatest? You might be surprised to learn it's none of those things. No, his greatest legacy is that he stepped aside. You might think, that's strange. His greatest legacy is he quit, but yes, that is true. And if you take a tour of his home today in Virginia, my home state, Mount Vernon, this is what they will tell you. That is truly his greatest legacy. Because when you compare him to history's other revolutionary leaders, going all the way back to Julius Caesar, you have Julius Caesar, you have Oliver Cromwell, you have Robespierre, there's Napoleon, there's Lenin, there's Hitler, there's Castro, and now more recently Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe. What do all those men have in common? The answer is, while many of them overthrew governments that were tyrannical, oppressive, or in some cases not so much oppressive. I mean, Louis XVI really wasn't oppressive. They were just incompetent. While those men all overthrew governments that were at least incompetent, if not tyrannical and oppressive, they all went on to become dictators in their own right. In many cases, they were worse than the governments they replaced. And certainly some, and probably the majority of those cases, in the end, these countries in question would have been better off if the revolution had never even happened. George Washington was in the same position to do just that. He could have made himself a king and a tyrannical leader of the new United States of America if he had wanted to. He was popular enough to do that, but he refused. He said after his second term, no, there are plenty of other fine men in this country to lead this country, and if there aren't, then this republic is doomed, and I am not going to be the one to bury it. And as a result, the United States of America is much better off thanks to that legacy he set of stepping aside. Thankfully, we have seen some examples of this in more recent revolutionary leaders. The best examples are the leaders who led the revolutions in Eastern Europe back in 89 and 91. Men like Lech Walesa, Václav Havel, Boris Yeltsin, they did not go on to become dictators in their own right. And also Nelson Mandela in South Africa served only one term and insisted on stepping aside after that. The reason I mention all of this is because, at least in the First World West, we have thankfully seemed to have moved away from violent revolutions. Instead, what we now have are social movements. And sadly, the same phenomena can now be seen with social movements. Many of these movements began because there was a genuine need. Indeed, they were often long overdue. They saw an injustice, they organized to end this injustice, and thanks to their organization, thanks to their hard work, and they met a lot of resistance early on oftentimes, a lot of injustices were ended. Trouble is, they should have thrown a party, dissolved, and gone home, but they didn't. Instead, these social movements went on to become injustices in their own right. Oftentimes, just as bad, if not worse, than the problems they sought to correct. Indeed, sadly, in some cases, they became the very things they said they didn't like. We can see this with unions. We can see this with feminists, for example. And this is what my point here is. These social movements need to know when their time is up. They need to know when the good fight is over to go home and dissolve. See, in many ways, social movements are like society's medicine. But all medicines come with side effects. And medicines taken when they're not necessary cause side effects for no benefit. So my message in all this is, just because a social movement may have been great back in its day does not mean it should not be criticized, and does not mean it should not be shut down. After all, shutting it down should be the goal, right? I'm reminded of what Tammy Bruce said when she, as a young, naive feminist, thought that that's what feminism wanted. But some of the elders confided in her that we have to occasionally rub salt in order to stay relevant. I want you to take a minute to let that sink in. And I'll be referencing that point in future videos because it really shows what the problem is. I have studied numerous conflicts around the world while getting master's degrees and a PhD. And it's so difficult to solve a lot of the world's conflicts, even when both sides desperately want a solution and desperately want peace. The last thing in the world we need are movements that rub salt just to stay relevant. And there's no way we can work with these groups because they don't want to end the conflict if they're purposely rubbing salt to keep the conflict going. Such movements need to be shown for the cancer on society that they are, and they need to be shut down. So, by the way, I entitled this video George Washington's Greatest Legacy, a Critique of Social Movements. I did not mean to imply that George Washington's greatest legacy was a critique of social movements. I'm Dr. Carl. Enjoy.